Welcome to everyone in our audience to our first industry insider webinar of the fall semester. We're excited to kick these back off and get it going again. So yeah, we're excited and thank you for joining us. My name is Pam Persichetti. I am the Alumni Engagement Officer at the college, and this webinar series is brought to you all through the Alumni Engagement Office. And we plan to continue to do these throughout the fall. We're shooting for about 2 a month roughly, so stay tuned to your emails and social media as we announce the schedule for the future webinars that we have slated. And yeah, we're excited to roll them out as well. And today we have our moderator, Suzanne McCotter. She's the Dean of Education at TCNJ, and she is joined by 3 lovely faculty members of whom she will introduce when we get started. And we're going to tackle the tough topic of what this environment will look like for educators as we start the 2020 fall school year. I don't think they promise to have all of the answers, but at least they can offer some advice and some insight and some food for thought. And if nothing else, you'll know that you're not alone. So yeah, Suzanne, I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce the panel. Thank you all for being with us again. You were all with us in the spring. So thank you for your time again, and we're looking forward to it.
Thanks, Pam. And no, you're definitely not alone. There were hundreds of people who signed up for this, and we're excited that we are perceived as people who have some valuable advice to give. We hope we live up to that. So just a couple of background pieces of information. First of all, thank you for sending in some questions, because we're going to try to use those to guide our conversation. And we really do envision this as a conversation. So I will moderate and I'll throw out some questions, but the panelists are all going to try to talk with each other and so that you can eavesdrop on the conversation these smart people are having with each other about the fall. My job as moderator is when we start getting redundant or going off track, I'm going to interrupt whoever's talking and go on to the next person. That's my job as moderator. A couple other words of wisdom. One of them is that we don't have a magic bullet here. We're going to try our best to give you some good thoughts about what to do. Everybody's looking for answers. We are too, and we've been talking and thinking a lot about some good answers. We also, some of you sent in questions about state guidance. Right now, the state is focusing on making sure that all students get an equitable education, that they're valuing what in-person education looks like, and they're asking people to be flexible and responsive because we don't know what's coming next. So we don't have the voice of the state on this webinar, so we can't tell you what's in the state's minds. The state this week is working on reviewing and stamping approval to all of the district plans. And your districts, for the most part, every district that I've looked at online has a plan online, so you should be able to see that if you haven't done it already. So what I'm going to do now is invite our panelists to introduce themselves to you and to talk with you a little bit about what their fall looked like, what their spring looked like as they transitioned to this remote teaching. All of them are both teacher educators and parents, and they can give you a little bit of insight into what their world was like. Also, any one of my 3 colleagues here may have one or more of their children pop in at some point, and we will all be so happy to see them if that happens. So let me first introduce Dr. Lauren Madden from our Elementary and Early Childhood Education Department.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Madden, and like Dr. McCotter said, I'm in Elementary and Early Childhood Education. I'm a science educator. I have twin 7-year-olds who are rising 2nd graders that I live with. Last spring, I was on sabbatical, so I got to really wear the parent hat more than the professor hat for a while. But this past summer, I just wrapped up teaching a course with teachers, 30 teachers in 9 time zones all around the world. So I've gotten a pretty good perspective as to what distance learning has looked like everywhere, which has been really nice. And I think informs the way I'm thinking moving forward. This fall, my children, if my district continues to have a hybrid option, they will do some of that. And we're trying to figure out childcare and everything else. My husband's an essential worker, so it's me. And that's about it.
Thanks, Dr. Madden. Dr. Jonathan Davis is from our Educational Administration and Secondary Education program. Jonathan?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Jonathan Davis. I'm in our Educational Administration Secondary Ed. I coordinate our urban secondary education program. And the spring was an adventure for me. I've got a 3-year-old and a now 10-month-old who was about 5 months old when the quarantine started. And you know, it was a balancing act between my wife and I, with usually having 1 or 2 kids with us at all times while we were trying to figure out the synchronous versus asynchronous teaching. We all did the best we could. We laughed a lot. We cried a lot. We learned a lot of strategies to try and keep our students engaged and let them know that we're all going through this together. And similar to Lauren, I was able to teach one of our global courses over the summer that allowed me to kind of take a breath and understand, like, I'm going into this preparing to teach just virtually, which was a very different feeling and a much better feeling. And I was able to learn strategies that I'm sure we'll talk about today. And in the fall, you know, our 3-year-old has just recently gone back to daycare. So we've got our 10-month-old home with us, and we're trying to figure out what that'll look like. And there will likely be many pop-ins of kids during classes. And that's just something that my students are gonna know, and hopefully they will enjoy it.
Thanks, Jonathan. And Dr. Michael Smith is an associate professor in our Special Education, Language, and Literacy department.
Hey, y'all. My spring, like many of you, was trying to figure out what to do once you get thrown into the remote learning space. I taught online classes before, so I had some sense of what to do, at least the basics of it, but it was incredibly difficult doing that on the fly. So it's very different in being planful from the beginning and thinking about what a course is going to be, as opposed to having your best laid plans for what your semester is going to be face to face, and then suddenly trying to transform all that to try to maintain the classroom culture that was established in the face, think about how to do the small group work, the collaborative work, all of those things in the online space. I have a 6-year-old son, and his school was a challenge trying to help him manage suddenly being flung, and I use flung. He's flung into remote learning. Fortunately, his teachers really made that transition more or less seamless because they had already integrated technology into what they were doing anyway, in terms of how they were communicating with parents. They had already been using an online platform for kids to share their work with parents, to collaborate, and so it actually worked, you know, pretty well. In the fall, he'll be doing remote learning too, and so my wife, her job doesn't allow her to have as much flexibility as I do, so I'll be doing, like Lauren, much of the work with him in his school, and my own classes I'm only going to be teaching online. And one of the things that College of New Jersey did this summer, which was incredibly helpful for us, is to allow us to do training on online teaching. And I found that incredibly helpful in thinking about what I'm going to do differently with my courses this semester, as opposed to what I built on in the spring. I'll be happy to share some of those lessons learned too, because I think some of those things will translate. Some things obviously won't, because what you do in K-12 spaces is different, but there are some fundamentals about teaching online that I think would be useful for you all.
Great, thank you. So I think I also forgot to mention that if questions come up as we're talking, we are going to try to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So type your questions into the chat, and Pam Persichetti, who is on screen as TCNJ Alumni Engagement right now, she'll feed us some questions at the end. I will try not to be triggered and lose focus by seeing that little red number go up next to chat, and really focus on what people are saying instead. So Jonathan, I'll shoot the first question to you, and then Lauren and Michael, please jump in as you want to. how should teachers prepare for the blended and remote learning they're going to be facing this fall?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of one of the questions to think about. And for me, it's something that you need to kind of reconcile with yourself, and how are you going to best engage all of your students through different formats. And I've thought a lot about this, and I feel that right now students going into the fall need to feel connected to their classroom and connected to the curriculum. And one of the best strategies that I've heard in talking to a friend of mine who teaches in New York City is thinking about the planning in terms of, for each unit, what are meaningful inquiry-based projects that my students can work toward. And so if you think about in terms of that planning, if you're able to rethink each of your units you want to be teaching, and this goes K-12, and think about what are things that I want my students to be producing, and how can I make it meaningful for them? How can I make it so that they feel what I'm doing isn't busy work, how what I'm doing is kind of interesting to me and I want to be doing it, and that in some ways it might be kind of like a flipped classroom model where, like, when you're at home, like, there are things you can work on even if you don't have great internet access, and that if you're in person, so this would be for more the hybrid folks who are teaching part in person and part virtual, that this will give you a space where, if you know that for each unit you're kind of building towards something cool that you care about, you're going to want to do it, you're going to want to learn the skills, you're going to want to watch some really cool videos and do some assignments and read some things if your kids know how to read, because so for 5-year-olds they're learning how to do that. That would be a little different, but the idea would be that if each unit over the course of the year is planned in that way, then students are going to want to engage. And when you're in person, you'll adapt what you can do to sort of benefit from the in-person stuff. But when you're not in person, the students still care enough about wanting to learn more about whatever this topic is, that they're going to be doing the work that you've scaffolded for them.
Thanks, Jonathan. Michael, Lauren, go ahead. Go ahead, Michael.
I was actually going to hop in. I think that Jonathan's point about making sure students feel connected is so important. So, like, when we were given a choice by our district whether to go hybrid or to go remote, one of the biggest concerns I had was, how connected is my son going to feel to his teacher, and how well is his teacher going to know my son? And so I don't know exactly, obviously because school hasn't started yet, what that teacher's plan is for that. So there's some things that you get from being with the kids every day, about like who they are, what they're interested in, what they're capable of or not. I wonder how much will she actually know him beyond his products. So he's gonna turn stuff in, and she will know what he can write. I don't know how she's gonna assess how he reads, but there's the other intangible things about knowing and more deeply knowing a person that affects the overall experience of school. So when you began with that connection to school, that's what immediately came to mind, was my concern as a parent, of how well will that person know my kid, and how well will my kid feel known by his teacher. Sorry, Lauren, hop in.
Muted anyway, that's all right. I think something I've learned this summer with my experience teaching these global teachers is that being very purposeful about how we choose modalities, both the technologies we use with our students and what we ask them to do that's not so techie. So for instance, I found this summer, I decided to have multiple short Zoom drop-in sessions. And that's where I got to know my students. Those short times where, whether we were talking about assignments or we were just talking about how their day was. And I think that sort of informed me for my own teaching. And I kind of reflected back to both my sons. They were 2 first graders in the same building and had vastly different experiences in 2 different classrooms. And I will say, short, purposeful, smaller group web conferencing, I think can do a lot to build that sort of knowing of the students. I also, and I think before 2 weeks ago, I don't know that I necessarily would have said this, or this was part of my own educational philosophy, but the gamification, especially at the K-3 level, really does a lot. So like my kids are doing the county public library reading contest as well as the one for their school, and logging the minutes and doing this kind of thing. I think some kind of gamification in independent reading, in solving some math problems and doing scavenger hunts around your neighborhood, around things like that. Again, I don't know that that would have been something I recommended before, but a lot of my students this summer talked about that being an effective mechanism for having some high quality asynchronous activities. And then for my own children's motivation this summer, I can't believe it. Not that they weren't into reading before, but it's changed the way they've thought about it. So I think trying to be really purposeful about the types of things we put out there for our students, both synchronously and asynchronously, to make sure that there's a point in increasing motivation and getting to know kids personally in those kinds of ways.
Yeah, Lauren, you made a point of sort of getting to know all of your students and those small spaces. And I think that I agree, I did that over my summer course as well. And one thing I realized through those meetings is like, I really need to get a sense of what their needs are in this moment, right? And so I think that, you know, if you can do that early in the semester and get at least small group or one-on-one time with your students, you can get a sense of like, what is the context of their living situation and their tech access and things that have happened in their lives that greatly impact their ability to focus on school. And if you do that kind of needs assessment of each of your students, it can shape your curriculum, where maybe you were initially going to do lots of group work, but then you're realizing that for the students that I have, they can't find ways to digitally, you know, virtually get together. And you know, the gamification could be like, to do it collaboratively could be great because it's awesome, right? But maybe you realize let's gamify things, but maybe it needs to be more independent for this group I have because they're not able to interact in the same way. So I think that, you know, in terms of culture building, getting to know them, you know, the sooner you can get to know their needs in the semester, the more you can shape what you're doing from what you would pre-plan to make it as meaningful as possible.
And just to kind of come off of that too, I also want to really try to not have preconceptions just as a teacher right now. So TCNJ made the decision to switch to remote, and 70% of the students in my class wanted to do flex. So to me, I don't want to go in there thinking, oh, they're going to hate this and they really don't want this to be what they're doing. I don't want to make that kind of assumption. So I've been really trying to think about like, what are the best ways I can put small groups together to have just sessions with me and 5 students at a clip here and there to try and build some of those activities and find ways to make community and make meaning in an alternative kind of format.
So let me follow up on one of the things that several of you mentioned. You talked specifically about ways that we as teachers can start to make connections with our students, but we also know that classroom community is also formed by students making connections with one another, that there's more to the classroom community than the teacher and his or her individual students. So Michael, let me turn it to you first to talk about how can teachers start to think about creating a classroom community if they're doing virtual learning?
Some of that will also depend on your platform that you're going to use. And so for our campus platform, like again, I knew some of what it could do, but until I actually did training and webinars and stuff, I didn't know exactly what was available in terms of collaboration, in terms of how I make and post videos, all those sorts of things. And so I think what you do in terms of your community and creating opportunities for students to get to know students will depend on how you can leverage what's available on the platform to do small group work in the synchronous classroom, what kind of projects you can create for them to do, like Jonathan talked about. Depending on the age group too. So like we're spanning, think about K-12, our school, for instance, they tried to do things like virtual lunch dates. I mean, it sounds silly, but like those things keep students connected to one another, and keep those relationships going. I think there is something to really thinking through, how do I create this on the platform? What are the things that we would normally do in a face-to-face setting that is replicable in the online setting?
I found also to kind of go on top of that, things like Flipgrids or little Padlets and short, 30-second videos and ways to do that. I know my kids, like for Teacher Appreciation Week, they had Flipgrids for all the teachers in my kids' school, and they couldn't wait to watch and see why all these children were thankful for their teachers, and to listen to that kind of stuff. And I think giving chances to have those kinds of things, which are sort of high tech but low connectivity, where you don't have to assume a whole lot of internet access to do those things, can help them sort of know who the other people in their class are. And then maybe some kinds of, especially at the older grades, some of these inquiry-based projects, letting students have some degree of choice in terms of topics and things like that. So you could commune with others in your class who are all really into this particular topic. And that can allow for some of that too.
And another thing that I think was helpful, thinking back now, so what worked well, as a lesson learned from the spring, the kids really like seeing what other people did. So like to see other people's products, to be able to comment on other people's products. So, Jonathan writes a story, he posts it to the classroom, people can write comments under it. There were multiple ways to demonstrate content knowledge. And so for some of the things, you could record a video of yourself explaining X thing that went to the class. Sometimes you would write it and take a picture of it. I think those also help the students, because that's what you would do in the physical space. You would show your product, you would talk about it, you would explain your work. People would tell you what they liked about it. So that's also something that I think helps that peer-to-peer connection.
Yeah, and I think also just thinking about community building early in the year, so it depends on your platform. So if you have access to breakout rooms and whatnot, that can really facilitate that. But also, taking time away from your curriculum to really focus on specifically just community building and doing icebreakers and activities where your students get a chance to, I would probably start with some way for students to produce something that represents what their experience has been like living through the pandemic, right? And so, I've been doing a version of that with a consulting job that I do, where students are producing it and putting it on Instagram. But it's a way for students to, one, open up and share with one another. And if you allow them to get into small groups and kind of have different sharing spaces and focus more on sort of the focus on who are you, what are you going through, let's get to know one another, and less about, hey, we're preparing for a test and you've got to learn these specific skills in the first few weeks, and you're building in time every time you're together in person and virtually, to have these exercises and produce things and be able to share in small groups and all together that are more focused on the individual and the group and the community building, and at the same time maybe using some of these tech platforms that you want to be teaching them. So whether it's Flipgrid or Padlet or others that people have access to, it could be a great way to kind of learn some new tech that everybody should know if we go back to completely remote, which we all know is likely, there's a good chance that happens. While also really having that community, because I saw that question in the Q&A or the chat of like, what do we do with the first few weeks in person if we have that? I would say that community building is most critical during that time, so that by the time you go completely virtual, which is there's a good chance it happens, the community's there already. And if you're starting out remote, these are still things you can do. You just need to, like Michael said, learn your platform and figure out like what's the best way to connect people.
So I think one of the things that all of you are talking about is that we as teachers don't just focus on the academic development of our students. We also are always thinking about personal development, social emotional development, all those other kinds of things that make good teachers really focus on the whole child. So we know that there are academic implications to all of the changes that we faced due to COVID, but there are also social emotional issues that we need to think about. So Lauren, can you give some insight into how teachers might be able to tune into and address these with their students?
So one of my favorite examples comes from a colleague of ours in chemistry, Benny Chan, who I follow him on Twitter. And I think, and this is probably especially for older kids, but he had these weekly check-ins with his students that I thought were, what a good way to get a sense of what was going on. So everybody would contribute a song to a class playlist on Spotify, or they would make different kinds of memes. And they would do a lot of these sort of check-ins, which could let him as the teacher be able to sense like, oh, this person's really stressed out, or maybe this person's in a good place now. And those kinds of things. I think a lot of those kinds of frequent check-ins, it's really hard to say, thinking about, a high school teacher who's got 120 students, like to be able to have a lot of those one-on-ones is not super realistic, but maybe to allow for some of that to happen within smaller groups and whatnot, and modeling a lot of the short mindful minute type things and breathing activities and getting kids in the correct headspace. And I think the other side too is, so when we're thinking about the social emotional learning, some of what makes for good social emotional learning is having students who are truly interested in the types of content that they're covering as well, and maybe we do away with some of these big chapter tests and we think instead about letting a kid deep dive into a tiny little tangential topic that can help you to connect to where they're going. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm curious what other people have to say.
I think with larger groups also, because it's very different for us versus having 120, 160 students. You could even do a Google form of just like a weekly check-in, how you doing? Where students know that they'll be heard and they know that you're gonna read through, and as the teacher, then it's kind of on you or on us, right, as the teachers to not just ask for the information, but demonstrate to the students that we're hearing them and we're implementing what they're thinking. So, I think that if you could balance the kind of cool, creative ways that Lauren described with just like more simple, like, how you doing check-ins, and it could be just simply that question, or it could be sort of a couple scaffolded questions. And you just let them know from day one in the year that, like, we're going to do this every week. It's going to be a weekly kind of check-in. And if you need more, I'm here for you. But know that I have good weeks and bad weeks. And as a teacher, I need to know how you're doing so I can support you. And just the act of doing that is going to help, I think, a lot of students feel the support that they're seeking.
With that, my son's school, those teachers, they did that with our first graders. So they had a Google Forms. It was like a 3-question thing of how was your weekend? How are you doing? What do you need from me? And what do you want to share? And the options had both emojis and the written text. And so like the students are reading and they're writing something. And I think the teachers did a good job of normalizing when they were framing that this is what we're going to start doing and I need to get this from you, normalizing that, well, this was a hard weekend for me last weekend, or I really miss you all. And like normalizing both the good and the things that were hard about being away from school and away from the students. And they replied too. So I think that's useful. So sort of building on what Jonathan said, I experienced that last year. Another thing is to notice, not be afraid to check in with the student. And when you notice people aren't participating or not as involved. So last spring I had multiple students who, after we left campus, I didn't hear from them again. So they were doing their work, they were super diligent, and then it just sort of fell off a cliff. And so, like, I think it was something to say, like, are you okay? Let me check in, let me be persistent in that way. So that also, that deep noticing of the students, I think is also helpful.
Yeah, and I think along the same lines, one of the things, particularly with older kids, maybe not particularly, but one of the things I've noticed in our conversations about college age students is that we need to set some expectations at the beginning about what being a part of our classroom community means. So does that mean keeping our cameras on? Does that mean a certain amount of participation? The college age students who I've talked with, and my son's college age, so I talked to him and his friends, are that they're, when the teacher sets the expectation, then they will follow it. So they just need some, or they'll explain why they can't. So that there's some, and that does help, you know, seeing your faces helps. So.
Yeah, I was on a training. Well, I'm doing this webinar thing now, this training, and I think the moderator for that did like a really great job saying that even though we're in a distant space right now, you're not actually like watching a show. So like the person on the other side who's speaking needs to see your face. If you agree with what they're saying, tell your face. So like smile or nod your head, like get your shoulders and your neck involved in the conversation like you would if we were sitting in front of each other. I mean, to speak to empty black tiles is weird. Like there is another human on the other side of it, and so how do we engage fully, you know, verbally and non-verbally in the conversation that's happening? And I thought that's sort of a funny way to say it, but also an important reminder that we're not, you know, don't be a passive spectator at the screen, but know that this is still a human thing that's happening.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
But I think along those lines too, setting the expectations for frequent communication has to come along. So I think you feel differently about the black square if the person shoots you an email in advance and says, look, there's 8 people in my house today. I'm gonna have my headphones on, everybody's running around. I'd rather not, I'm probably gonna participate mostly on chat. That allows you to kind of give them that grace and understand that they're still participating, but you as the teacher can't make that assumption. You have to, and you have to allow those mechanisms for, look, if you can't participate fully with the camera, I get it, but tell me why. Because just, I don't want to is not really sufficient, and that's not really participating.
Yeah, and I think to build off of all of that, with class expectations, one thing I did with the course I taught this summer, and I think this could work in K-12, just adapting it for your age group, is on the first day coming up with the class expectations together. So I did it in the Google Doc, which with older kids you can do, and had people adding things that they would like, and then what it kind of would look like. So if you know, we could do like the dancing, showing your excitement, you know, what it might sound like, and these are things. It can be like a moving document over the course of the semester or the year that you keep coming back to of you know, is this working for us? Is it not working? What does it look like? And a part of those things, you know, as a teacher, you can facilitate this list. Like, I think we should come up with something about, you know, what happens if there's a lot going on in your house? Like, what are expectations for that? And so you name it, you talk about it, and you acknowledge that, you know, we understand everybody's going through something, but if students, you know, if students feel a part of the creation of those expectations and the adaptation of them as you move, I think that there's going to be more buy-in and hopefully more understanding along the way. But again, as the teacher, especially I think with the younger kids, you're going to have to probably facilitate that much more heavily than you would if you're teaching seniors in high school. But I think just that more democratic collaborative process, especially in this setting, can be really powerful.
So let me piggyback off of that and talk about something that worked for me this summer along those lines. And this applies in a couple different ways, but I had everybody choose a font and a color. And we had a lot of these like class Google Slides or Google Docs that people contributed to. So sometimes if there was a way I wanted to kind of get what everybody's shared understanding was, or build a class concept map or something like that, you were doing it mostly anonymously. Like there was a degree of, oh, nobody's going to make fun of me for giving that answer about this or that. But as the instructor, I could go back to the master list and know that like Blue Ariel is this person, and I need to go back to them. So that was a way, and I think older kids could definitely do that. I don't know about K3 so much, but that was helpful, one, for making sure we had full participation, and two, just as a formative assessment for me. That was a helpful way to organize that way.
Now, everyone can see why I picked these people to be on this panel. So in addition, one of the other concerns we as educators have is about equity. And New Jersey has committed to making sure that all K-12 students have access to the technology that they need to connect in a virtual environment. But we know that that is not going to mean that everything is all of a sudden equitable. And we still have equity concerns on a lot of different levels. So Jonathan, let me start with you to think about how can educators really support students and families equitably when it comes to technology and all of the other equity issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Simple
I would,
question.
yeah, I mean, it's such a hard question. And I don't think that there's no magic bullet for this, but I think going back to something I was saying earlier about doing a needs assessment, I think that it's going to be really important that each school and each teacher, you really get a sense of what students have and what they need, and that's gonna have to shape your curriculum and what your expectations are and what you ask of your students. And so if you know that in your classroom you've got 20% of your students who don't have consistent access to a laptop or to Wi-Fi, or their Wi-Fi never works, you're going to have to rethink how are you getting information to them, how are you getting content to them, and this is something where I don't think you should be on an island. You need to be communicating with your administrators and supervisors and figuring out how are we getting students what they need, and how can we re-envision what check-ins look like. How can we make sure that those students who are living in spaces, and you might be teaching students who are homeless. You might be teaching students who are consistently on the move and moving around the state. You're likely, hopefully, but not going to be teaching students who family members come down with COVID and who are in the hospital, and they kind of go, sort of off the map, like Michael was talking about. And so, I think that if we can stay in touch with our students and kind of pre-plan, like, how am I going to be getting information to my students and content to them in each of these kind of worst case and best case scenarios? And then how am I going to connect my students with one another when some have access and some don't? All we can do is the best we can. But I think that our students, we really need to be thinking about our students who aren't getting this access. How do we make sure that they still feel a part of our community, that they still feel like they are getting access to you, into the school, into the curriculum and content as best they can?
Some of it is also, there are gaps in capital between students and families as well. And so one of the things that teachers can do is help advocate for students who just may not know what resources are available, right? And so like there are some places, some districts who have Chromebooks to give. There are spaces and places that are doing wireless hotspots. It's possible that depending on the person's connection to resources, they may not know that those things are even available in the first place. So an example I'll share from the spring, I had a student who was writing his paper on his phone. And he depended on the computer lab on campus where the students had to leave. Suddenly he has no computer and his paper was late. And then so I sort of check in and say, what's up with your paper? He tells me he's been doing it on his phone. I sent an email to Dean McCotter, and we do have resources. He was able to get a computer, but he didn't know. He didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't know that he could ask. And he was doing the best he could. God bless him, writing a paper on a phone, I might have just emailed the professor and said, I can't do this. But he was still trying to work it through. So we may be able to help students and stand in the gap and help them out in that way. And with the resources that we know, to fill in for the resources they don't know that they have access to.
So I don't want to be all doom and gloomy, but one of the things I think we have to think about in this situation too is really downstream to April or September of 2021, when things go back to a more normal situation. I applaud and appreciate the state making a commitment that every K-12 student will have access, but kids who've been abused at the hands of their parents since March, kids who are homeless and aren't getting these emails, kids whose families are undocumented. That's who I worry the most about. And no matter what provisions are made, those are going to be students who are really hard to meet the needs of. So I think we as teachers also need to think about what's the most comprehensive and loving and robust plan we can come back to for April or September or whatever that date is that everybody's back, to help to mitigate some of the further gaps that are created here. And I agree, obviously I agree wholeheartedly about, we need to be out there looking for some of these solutions and knowing how to connect people with some of the technology that they need, and knowing how to connect people with some of the services and resources out there. But I think we also need to be keenly aware that for some children, that connection is just not going to happen. And we need to know how we follow up and fix it, not fix it, but address it later. Sorry, that was kind of doom and gloomy.
It's real.
Yes.
That's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. So we have some teachers who have additional support, additional people who they can work with. So some people have paraprofessionals, some have parents who are volunteering to help out in different ways, and some, hopefully from TCNJ, have student teachers. Which can feel like an additional burden, because you're also thinking about managing adults in addition to teaching all the young people who you're responsible for. So how can we use those adults as an asset? How can we really use student teachers and other people to help us in our instruction? What kind of strategies might we use? Michael, let's start with you.
Sure. So I supervised a practicum course last semester, and it was a challenge. All right. So again, everybody's flung into the remote space, and some teachers had really thought through how to use an extra pair of hands, and others couldn't. Hopefully, in the space between March and now, some more thinking has been done about that. One of the comments that Lauren made before about breaking things up into smaller chunks, if you have other sets of hands, you can break your class of 20 into smaller groups to have the para running a group, you run a group yourself, have the student teacher run it as well. Again, you can approximate what you would do in your regular face-to-face classroom in that way. By splitting that work up. I think there are strengths that your para will have, strengths that your student teacher will have, and just thinking through, how do I take this big chunk of work and break it down so that students are more engaged. I know that things, my son was far more engaged when there were, maybe 6 of them doing something, as opposed to when there were many more students in the Google Classroom on that Google call. I think it also helps the teacher to know what's happening with the students. So like on a Zoom call, once you're like 4 or 5 tiles deep, like you can't see what's happening. You can't see who's involved, who's engaged. You can't see the raised hand unless they click the raised hand. So I think you can use that extra set of hands to shrink the group that's working, and maybe you do a smaller group and then a larger group check-in. But there's something to like using those extra sets of hands to make the smaller groups that I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I think also, it depends on how many people you have, but I think that making sure that you, if you have a support teacher, if you have a paraprofessional, if you have student teachers, that you really spend even, I mean, you should be doing this anyways, I think, but really explicitly spending time together, co-planning sort of what your plan of action is to best implement and integrate a lot of the things that Michael was talking about, because you want to make sure that you're all on the same page. You want to make sure that you're all supporting the students in the same ways that they need it, and there's that consistency. Because then it is going to be more of a like just amazing small group experience versus students, because they'll talk to each other. So it depends on the age group, right? But like if they feel like, oh, I've got like this one person and I'm stuck with this other person, like that's not, you want it to be where everybody's excited just to be with a teacher figure. And so I think putting in that work together as a team to truly become a team in this virtual or this hybrid experience is gonna make a big difference.
I think another place here too, and this is something that I struggle with myself as as an adult, as a wife, as a teacher, is really delegating purposefully. So I know a while back when we thought we might still have some practicums for some of our pre-student teaching placements, I was talking to some principals about our science and math methods placements, and both of them like jumped at, oh, we could really differentiate math again. That would be great. We could have an adult in each room and that would be wonderful. I know especially at the elementary level, math in particular is something that you need these small groups. So I think, you as the teacher, you tell your para, you're always going to work with group B, and you're always going to need to be a step ahead of them and know how to do this backwards and forwards, and same with your student teacher. So I think for the teacher in the room to really be careful and purposeful about the way you divide groups for these types of things, so that the other adult can be as effective as possible working with them. But I think there's a lot to be said and a lot to be gained from being able to entrust some other adults with the group. And I think especially in terms of going back to some of the social emotional learning too, some of those side conversations and the little check-ins that can happen, or that kids might be willing to share within a group of 4 or 5 that they wouldn't whole class, you can benefit a lot that way too. But that really takes some masterful delegation of specific tasks, and not just, oh, Tuesday we're going to break into groups,
And I think there's for those who are going hybrid, and it seems like those who are in person are likely going to be hybrid and to some degree. And I saw a question in the chat about how do I manage being in person all day with students and then also managing the virtual space. I think that that's a perfect place where if you have a student teacher, or if you have a co-teacher or a paraprofessional, that maybe you say like, listen, either you can be the point person for the virtual space, or maybe we rotate it as a group. But I think that if you have the advantage of having another adult to collaborate with on this, that thinking about how you can kind of divide and conquer is going to be important, so that those who are virtual still feel seen and heard as much as those who are in person with the teachers.
And it also may help to have that person on large sessions like this. Like maybe that person is your chat moderator, right? And so like trying to do it alone and pay attention to whatever content you're communicating, facilitating a discussion, and then there's questions. You have your red number telling you that there are questions in the chat. And by the time you get to the chat question, 20 minutes could have gone by. But the person forgets what they asked or why they asked it, and so it may be helpful to have someone to take that role as well, depending on the content that you're teaching.
So I want to give Pam a chance to share some of the questions that are in the chat, because she's been our facilitator. Let me just say 2 more things about student teachers. One, if there are any of you on this webinar who are going to be student teachers, we're going to be doing a lot of work with you before student teaching actually starts in your boot camps, and we'll probably do a town hall with the STEP office so that you'll get some of those specific questions answered and you'll get reassured. And if any of you out there are really looking for student teachers, please contact our STEP office. I'll put the email address in the chat. Particularly, we have some student teachers who really want to do their student teaching remote for a variety of reasons. They're living far from campus, they've got an immunity problem, so they want to help out with the remote part. So if you're somebody who's looking for that support, contact our STEP office. And Pam, while I put that email address in the chat, why don't you ask us a few other questions?
Sure. So I think a few of these questions were addressed in different ways, but one question that came through is, and I'm going to paraphrase, tips for high school parents on setting up a successful and independent at-home learning situation. I think the question was particularly for an older student who should be independent in some way, and how parents can maybe motivate or relay that in some way. And on that, also balancing the workload, especially for that high school age level.
I think it's Lauren's turn to start again. And we didn't even have this question on our Google Doc.
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, Jonathan's in secondary ed, but no, so I think I think what you're saying, and correct me, Pam, if I've misunderstood. So what kinds of guidance should teachers be giving parents of high school children about having a space set up? I think really just being very clear, saying that your student needs a place to sit where it can be quiet or they can have headphones. They need to have water breaks. They need to be able to take some time throughout the day to be able to look away from the computer. They need to maybe have some clear expectations and checklists. Like at my kid's school, again, this is elementary school, but the principal sent a note saying, you should not be wearing pajamas. You should be sitting in a chair where you can sit up straight. And some of these things sound obvious, but I think if I was 16, I might want to do this in bed rather than getting out and getting moving. Reminders to take a walk in between your activities, or different kinds of things that might feel like they're obvious to an adult, but need to be made explicit. I think little checklists for, am I ready to learn today? So do I have something to write with? Do I have a clear space to work? Do I have times marked off in my day where I'm going to take breaks and turn away? Do I have access to communicate with other students in my class? So maybe to put some of that sort of social emotional learning into your initial communication with parents as with the students. And just like with little ones where you have to teach them a routine, you have to teach them the routine of when we log in for social studies in second period, everybody has a pencil and paper next to their computer, and everybody needs to make sure that they downloaded this video and watched it the night before. And those, I think just being super explicit about that sort of stuff, the whole universal design for learning still works online, really making sure that the kids who need those extra reminders, everybody benefits from them. And in terms of just the balance, we were told this summer for the class that I was teaching, think about getting about 60% of what you would normally get done in the summer. I don't think that was necessarily true for me. I think we covered a lot closer to 100%, but thinking about knowing when I had to check in and back off, and knowing when maybe a project that was a little bit more elaborate needed to be scaled back a little bit. So that just goes back to that constant communication, both with your students and their parents.
And I just want to complicate your answer more, Lauren. Yes to literally everything Lauren said, but also, as teachers and as parents, we need to learn how our kids learn best. And so, I know just of the 5 of us who you can see here, my guess is as students, we were all very different students, and we all studied differently and learned differently and needed different environments to succeed and thrive. And so I think as a parent, you need to, if you don't know that already, figure it out collaboratively with your kid about like what is the optimal environment that is going to allow you to thrive. And so for some, it's going to be having all those checklists and figuring out the routine. For others, that's going to feel stifling. And so, and some may need to always have music on in the background and maybe like something else happening. And like, that was me. Like I needed TV, music, like whatever you could throw at me, like in the middle of a public space. Like that's how I learned. And so I think we just need to, as if you're the parent in this situation, like figure that out and then figure out like what's the best balance, sort of integrating all the strategies that Lauren said, to allow your kids to be successful.
Okay, thank you guys. And all right, another question here we had was, if there is going to be some in-person, and it may not be the entire semester, what are some of the most important things you could get out of that face-to-face time before either going back to hybrid learning, or if there is a face-to-face opportunity, what are some things you could focus on the most to get out of that time?
I'll hop in there.
Because we lost our moderator.
I think there's some wisdom in integrating whatever technology you think you would use in the worst case scenario. I think there's some wisdom to like starting the year doing that anyway, and like helping the students understand like how we would use another technology platform. I think creating community is also incredibly important. So we normalize sharing, we normalize how we work with one another. I see we have 3 minutes. I'll share just one other thing. I think over teaching routines and transitions are incredibly important. So all the ways that we would navigate around the Zoom space or the Google Classroom space, like over teaching that in the beginning. Some of the horror stories that I've heard about from lessons learned from other places already, they're trying to do all of this orientation to navigating this space with, you know, the entire class, where you can't really see how the technology is supposed to work. So I think whatever you want in terms of establishing community, prioritize that on the front end. Whatever you want to do in terms of your routines, prioritize investing your time into that while you have them, because it's so much harder to build that later. But if you can establish it on the front end, I think it pays dividends later on for you.
Can I just chime in my science teacher contribution to this? I think because so much of science teaching K through 12 involves physically manipulating objects. So I would spend that in-person time doing a lot of learning how to measure, learning how to do an observation in person, giving them some practice with stuff, because if they're going to be doing that stuff at home, having a chance to do it with your eyes on them once, I think would be really helpful. And I'm sure that goes for anything that involves any sort of tool. I imagine graphing calculators would be hard in math the first time kids have them, and that's probably playing around with them matters too. And that's part of a routine thing as well.
And that just made me think of what Lauren was saying, is if you could maybe spend some time also brainstorming, what could you use at home if you can't take these manipulatives with you? Like, what could you use at home that will still allow you to learn these things? And so it could be like cans of food or something else. So like, get creative together about how you can take the things that you've been building and learning together in these routines and in that transition to your home space and what that might look like.
All right, I'll try to squeeze in a couple more questions here in the last couple minutes that we have. Let's see. I had one, and I have two different, I have a chat and a Q&A box open here. What advice for ESL teachers with no para or extra adult in the hybrid situation? I don't know if any of you could speak to that specifically or not, or maybe your advice would be similar to what you've already given. I'm not sure.
I would say for ESL, just from talking to a lot of ESL teachers this summer in my class, maybe less of the, if you're not face to face, if maybe less of the Zooms and things like that, and a lot more videos that students can slow down and pause and go back to. I know Kaltura does, and Zoom for that matter. If you make a video of yourself in a one-person Zoom meeting, it will transcribe it for you. I had no idea, but that, I mean, Zoom itself is a great tool. If you save it, if you upload the recording to the cloud, it will send you the transcription. So I would rely, for ESL students in particular, a lot of short videos that can be slowed down and have transcripts as maybe some of the better tools to use with those students.
Any last question, Pam, or should we wrap it up? And my apologies to everybody. My power blinked and my router went out.
Let's see. Just making sure if there's any quick answers. Again, the recording will be available. I think I'm going to try, hopefully, with some help to condense some of these great tips and tricks and get them out to the folks that attended or registered, just to try to condense this. I'm not a teacher, and I was writing down notes and notes of things that I feel like I could implement. So,
and Pam, while you're just looking over that, I'll just say that in 2 weeks, we're going to do a webinar with Dr. Scott Rocco, the superintendent from Hamilton School District, that is mostly geared towards parents, but I think it might also be valuable for teachers to be a part of that as well. So I encourage you to sign up for that. And I'm sure that Pam can tell you where you can get the information about it.
Yeah, I'm going to end with that. I just wanted to fit in one more question. I think it would be helpful for the folks on this call. And you did kind of mention the work-life balance, and Lauren, I think you kind of touched on that 60% of maybe what you can expect to cover. And maybe if you just want to end with some encouraging words for educators not to overwhelm themselves, we could leave on that uplifting note.
Man, I think one of the things to remember is that, like, I don't think anybody really has it down. Like, it's differently hard for us all, right? And so, as a person who's taught online before, like, still I have stuff that was hard about doing it. It's hard. It's hard teaching my son and doing this. Like, it's just differently hard. So I think having some grace for yourself, like being gentle with yourself, managing your expectations is helpful. One of the things that I think was really helpful for us in the spring is that our teachers, for my son, really tried to manage our expectations about what's reasonable to expect for him to do in a day. That was really helpful for me to recalibrate my expectations for him, and I really tried to take that into this new semester for him, and even the new semester for myself. We do what we can, and we do that to the best of our ability. But it's hard. We still have a responsibility, but I don't know. We have to be gentle with ourselves. So if you can extend that grace to yourself, I think that's helpful.
Yeah, and I would just say take breaks and be kind. And we're all overtired and overstressed and are, I think, overly critical of ourselves right now, just because of that lack of sleep. So remind yourself that when you have feelings of self-doubt and when somebody says something to you that triggers you in a certain way, or your students aren't responding in a different way, that we're all going through something that's unprecedented. And it's not just the COVID pandemic. There are other pandemics happening right now and other things that are happening in your lives. And so, when I get really down and have moments like that, I try and remind myself and try to do something for myself that's going to make me happy. Usually doesn't involve sleep, because who sleeps? But I think you just need to find that space for you to take time that's going to allow you to center yourself, and know that you're a different version of yourself right now, and that's okay. And you're not going to produce in the same way that you would typically when we're not going through all this stuff. And that's perfectly what it should be.
To go along with everything that my colleagues just said, I think also kind of knowing that everything is changing so much more quickly than ever has before. Like the decisions people make and the guidance that we get. And I think if it feels really terrible right now, in 15 minutes, it's something different. And as a type A person who makes a lot of lists and things like that, this has been really hard for me as it is for everybody else. But I think there is some comfort to know that, like, well, it might not always be that way. Well, we've got 3 vaccines in phase 3. This might happen sooner than we thought. You know, there might be, just to know that the more information we get and the way the information changes, your situation will not be the way it is for very long.
Every time Lauren talks about 3 vaccines in stage 3, it gives me a little lift.
I know.
Anytime you can give that lift to yourself and to others around you, I think it's really helpful. And also, one of the things I've been trying to do is just reframe for myself and for people I come into contact with. So as an example, none of the seniors this year got to go to prom. And let's face it, prom is never what you want it to be anyway. So instead of having collective memories of prom, they have collective memories of not the prom. Remember when we didn't have the prom because of the pandemic? And that's what every senior in the country has this year. So they've got a good party conversation for the rest of the year. And we just need to keep reframing. We're all going through the same thing.
This was excellent, everyone. Thank you so much. I put in the chat our website where you can find the upcoming webinars as well as the recordings, alumni.tcnj.webinars/webinars, excuse me. And we will be advertising through email and social media as well for all of our upcoming fall webinars. And yeah, again, thank you so much. I think a lot of people got a lot out of this. And
thank you. And thank you for hosting it.
I'm not even an educator. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Take care. Stay safe.